I'm Cody Horton, Managing Director for Diverse Recruiting Experts. I've spent the past couple of decades helping companies with their diversity recruiting strategy and hiring a diverse workforce. And I'm thrilled today to have my good friend Eddie Pate with us. Eddie, I know that you're one of the most sought out inclusion and diversity consultants in the country. And so I appreciate you taking time to share your insight today. Um, Eddie's got an amazing background. He worked for some of the most recognized brands in the world, including Amazon and Microsoft and Starbucks and Avanade. But I don't want to shortcut this. Would you tell us a little bit about your journey and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, Cody, I definitely, and I should hire you as my marketing manager, man. Like the most sought out diversity consultant. Well, I'll take it. I'll take it. Um, so when I tell my story, I like to go back to the fact that I'm an Army brat, and not to draw it out, because I think it does pay. It plays into the significance of what I've done, going forward. Being an Army brat, traveling the world, my I'm a product of a mixed marriage. My mom was from Niederfischbach, Germany. My dad was from Tennessee, and they met in Europe. And I was born in Frankfurt, Germany. So lived in multiple places in Germany. Actually went to 3 different high schools, man, if you can believe it. Sophomore and junior year in Munich American High School, senior year in Monterey Carmel area at Seaside High. And I say all this because I traveled. I got to see different cultures and background, and I think that even though I didn't think of it then, that bug around fairness and difference and travel and cultural differences just was started then. Graduated from high school, and because of where I went to school, I ended up going to Humboldt State University in very Northern California, where I studied, and I know you know this, I studied wildlife management, right? I thought I was going to be a field or wildlife biologist, and it was this weird confluence of issues of why I ended up doing that. But I wouldn't trade it for the world, man. I still, to this day, I love photography and wildlife pictures and that kind of thing. So I ended up getting a wildlife degree, but I also played football. And so I ended up, my first year of college, I grew 3 inches and put on 30 to 40 pounds. And
Wow.
so by my sophomore year, I was an All-American football player at Humboldt. And so that kind of, I only say that not to brag. I just say that shifted my focus. And so I set my sights on playing professional football and got an opportunity to play very briefly with the San Diego Chargers, but I hurt myself in camp, tore an ACL. And back in the late 80s, when you tore your ACL, that is a year recovery. That's a cast. And it's much harder to come back than, with the techniques they use nowadays. So I ended up retiring from football pretty early on, pretty quickly. I'm one of the reasons why the average age of an NFL player lasts about 3 years, right? It's like, I'm hurting camp. And so I ended up going back to Humboldt, where I became the assistant director, the assistant director of admissions and school relations. And I started building a love for speaking and working with groups and leading, and begun formulating how I want to manage and lead people. And then I ended up leaving Humboldt, was married by then, had a 6-month-old little girl, and got a master's degree at Humboldt. And then we left to go get PhDs. And so we looked at multiple schools, ended up coming up to Seattle area, and we went to the University of Washington, both my wife and I, with a 6-month-old kid, because we had to do that, make it really hard.
Yeah, I make it difficult.
Yeah, make it difficult. And I started the program for sociology. It's comparative race and ethnic relations and social psych. Had another kid in 98, graduated in 2000. And I was at this inflection point, Cody, where I needed to decide whether I'm going to go into academia or I'm going to try to go into the corporate space and have an impact right away. I ended up choosing the corporate space, met someone who knew someone at Amazon or at Microsoft, met the head of diversity for Microsoft, Santiago Rodriguez. Remember Santiago?
I remember.
The brother was amazing. And I met Santiago. We hit it off. He introduced me to my very first manager and long-term friend now and mentor, Charles Stevens, in the Enterprise and Partner Group. And I think that was about the time that we met.
Right.
I spent 5 or 6 years at Microsoft, promoted to director, headhunted out by Starbucks, was director of diversity and inclusion for the Americas for Starbucks, left Starbucks after just a couple years. We could talk about that at another time. It just wasn't the right fit for me at that time. I started my own consulting business, had that for a few years, got headhunted out by Avanade, where I became the vice president of diversity and inclusion at this very global company, and really got a taste of the global nature of doing this work, which is amazing. Headhunted out by Amazon, where I spent the last 4 years of my career in the corporate space as the director of inclusion and diversity and equity for worldwide operations for globally for Amazon. I have 2 kids, like I said, married 34 years, man, have 3 dogs, and that's my journey. Now I have my own consulting company, Pate Speaking and Consulting, and I'm doing that part-time and looking forward to the day when we can have some normalcy in our society and I can get out and just speak. That's what I want to do, is get out and speak. So that's my plan, man, and travel.
Yeah, and travel.
Travel.
Well, you've got an amazing background. You've got some phenomenal accomplishments. I mean, certainly we've worked together and I've seen some of the great work that you've done. When you think about it on the personal side, and if someone said, who is Eddie Pate, how would you kind of sum that up?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, man. I would say first and foremost, I'm family. It's all about family first. I'm proud to say that even throughout my corporate career at the executive level, and I spent most of my career at that level, I think I might have missed one of my son's baseball games, right? You know what I mean? I think I might have missed one of my daughter's soccer matches. And so I identify, my identity is really wrapped up in being a parent and a dad. I mean, I love that. I think who I am, people would say I'm empathetic. I'm all about inclusion, awareness, fairness. As I said, I'm a sociologist. I'm an athlete. I'm proudly Black, right? I'm biracial, but I self-identify as Black male, and very proudly so. I mean, I love nature and animals. So I hate it when people drive slow in the left lane. It's that kind of stuff. But I love to give, and I would just assume help others as to get something in return, just because that's just kind of the way that it really moves me to be able to help people. I mean, as you can tell, I'm extremely extroverted. My wife is extremely introverted, so that makes it for really interesting parties. And like I said, when and I talked about going to beaches and stuff like that and traveling to Hawaii, I am someone who just finds solitude and peace walking on the beach and listening to the water and listening to the wildlife that's around you. I mean, I'm kind of complicated, man. I like to work out. I like to take pictures. Photography is a big bug. So I've got a lot of stuff going on, but it's about empathy and love, man. It's kind of where my head is.
Well, that's great to hear. One of the things what I think people are going to walk away with some amazing information of the topics around meritocracy and privilege, and really kind of coming at it through that leadership lens. I have to be honest. I've never spent much time thinking about meritocracy or privilege. Can you talk a little bit and explain a little bit about what is privilege, and then in the context of privilege and meritocracy, how do they play into this topic together?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think those are 2 really good questions. So I'm gonna start talking a little bit about privilege, and just going back to the point you just made too, that you've never really thought about privilege and meritocracy, and I bet a lot of your listeners haven't as well, because we're taught not to, and I'll explain why in a minute, right? Because it's critical that people to understand that piece of it. But I like to think of, again, this is my academic PhD geeky side of me, right? Is I like to cite and talk about different people. So Peggy McIntosh, for any of your listeners, look up Peggy McIntosh. She's done, I think, seminal, amazing work on this topic of what privilege is. And then other people have kind of used her framework to do the work, a guy named Deutsch, and I'm gonna talk about both of them. Think about privilege. The way I like to think about privilege and define privilege is, privilege is a set of unearned assets that you can count on using every single day. Here's the kicker for this. But it was also meant to remain oblivious. And that's the point I was making with you a moment ago. So it's this, and she uses this analogy that's really cool, of this invisible knapsack of privilege. So we all carry one, right? And in that knapsack, this invisible knapsack, you have all these unearned assets that you can use every day. And what's interesting about that too is for if we think about two categories, gender and race, if you think about white men, you think about those assets of being unearned advantage and also conferred dominance. And that's what she talks about. So those are two important keys, right? So it's unearned advantage and conferred dominance is also wrapped into what privilege is. And what's interesting about it is that we're taught not to recognize that privilege and keep oblivious to it. And here's where meritocracy and privilege ties in then, and we'll talk about that more here in a moment, is we're taught to be oblivious about privilege, because once we recognize privilege and the fact that you have these unearned assets that contributes to your success, it challenges the entire notion of meritocracy. Wow. It invalidates it. Wow. Right. So that's why you were taught. That's why you don't think about it. People want you to think about it, because then it just unearths and and does in this whole notion that we've earned everything that we've gotten just by our own talent and that kind of thing. And so, and I know this is a long-winded response, and what I want to do just really quickly, if you'll humor me, Peggy McIntosh did this really cool thing, and I have the list here. And what she did is, to hammer home what privilege is, she came up with this list of 50 things that you can count on in this unearned assets as a white person in society. And she has this long list of things, and I'm not going to read all 50. You're just going, oh my God, is Eddie going to sit there and read 50?
Hey man,
brother, I am not going to do that, but I'm going to read a couple, because I think it really does give your audience a sense of what she's talking about. These are very common everyday things. So she says, like, I can avoid spending time with people whom I was trained to mistrust and who have learned to mistrust my kind or me. If I need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area where I can afford, and which I would want to live. So it's stuff like that, right? When I'm told about national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it was. That's privilege, right? For white people, right? I can be sure that my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race, right? So she just has this list of all these different things, which are just profound. And what's amazing too is, and I mentioned a guy named Deutsch, he did it for men. And listen to the male privilege list. I'll give you just a couple, and then I think your audience would get a sense of what I mean by this invisible knapsack of privilege. For men, in male privilege checklist, my odds of being hired for a job when competing against female applicants are probably skewed in my favor. The more prestigious the job, the larger the odds are skewed. So that's super powerful, right? If I'm never promoted, it's not because of my sex. If I fail in my job or career, I can feel sure that this won't be seen as a black mark against my entire sex capability. The odds of encountering sexual harassment on the job are so low as to be negligible. So it's just all these privileges you get that you don't earn, but you just have, and it helps create the false sense of meritocracy that you've been successful on your own merit. So privilege is pretty powerful, man. And that's how so that gives you a good sense. Think of it as a set of unearned assets that you remain oblivious to.
Wow. Yeah, that is really powerful. I was talking with a colleague of mine who I have a lot of respect for, and she was talking about an interview that they did with a candidate who just wasn't very good, but had an amazing resume and background and was failing in the interview. But this candidate was majority, male, and her response was, this person's not a match for what we're looking for. The response of other white males who were very similar to that person thought, oh, he could do this job. We know he's got a background, he could do this job. So just kind of underscores the point that you're making, and it's real.
Yeah, it is real. And it is the benefits of privilege. And what's fascinating about this too, which I probably should have said it, and what I loved about what Deutsch said too, just quickly, is, and this is that very same situation that you're pointing out there, is the privilege. I have the privilege of being unaware of my male privilege. So even in that situation, that person has the right and privilege. The privilege is not even recognizing that privilege. and that person got that. There was an affinity. The person's, oh, that reminds me of who I am. If that were a Black person or someone who is definitely an other, then that you don't get that same benefit of the doubt in most situations.
Yeah. Well, Eddie, I know that you do a lot of you do a lot of leadership coaching. You do a lot of inclusion and diversity work and training. Um, how does that combination of privilege and meritocracy show up when you're working with clients?
Yeah, I love that question as well. A lot of what I do is in my consulting business, and even a lot of what I did over the last, I don't know, 10 years in the corporate space in terms of creating the kind of capabilities and leaders to be successful, was all about being inclusive leaders, right? How do you learn to be an inclusive leader? What are the variables that go into understanding what it means to be an inclusive leader? And where privilege and meritocracy play into it is, I've talked to leaders quite often that you can't hope to be an inclusive leader. You can't hope to create the kind of workplace environment where everyone feels like they can be successful because of who they are and regardless of who they are, if you don't recognize your privilege and the fact that meritocracy is a myth, right? You have to recognize that you've had help along the way. You've got to be willing to make that point clear. And at the flip side, which is super interesting, is men very clearly will point out, oh, women are disadvantaged. But at the same time, they won't say the flip side to that is that you're advantaged. They'll fight tooth and nail against that notion, right? No, not at all, right? I've got mine, I've earned mine, and let's help the women who are disadvantaged. And you're just like blown away, like, it doesn't jive, right? If she's disadvantaged, it's probably to the advantage of another group. And so inclusive leaders need to understand that that's part of the dynamic, right? And here's the kicker too, and how it ties into inclusive leadership. You can't be an inclusive leader if you are not somehow using your own privilege to the betterment of others. And I think that's the key of being it, right? It is about being humble. It's about being aware and understanding, but it's also recognize the power that you have to make the other people better. And I think that is how it ties into what it means to be an inclusive leader. Short of making sure you understand what it means, what the dynamics are, make a point of having who works for you and people who you report to understand the impact and power of privilege and meritocracy as well, or at least the fallacy of meritocracy, or however you define it. So that's how I think about it when I think about inclusive leadership. And at some point in this discussion, I think one of the things I'd like to do is do a little more kind of deep dive into meritocracy, if you will, if time allows, because I'd love to really tease this into this whole notion about, what are the different ways that people think about meritocracy, and are they valid, right? And what's the argument against it? And so I think that would be of value as well. So perhaps there's time to do that.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. Because we've both worked for companies that said, well, we're a meritocracy, right? We've been,
yeah.
We've heard that language. I don't know if those companies are still doing that, but I know that I've said before, I hadn't really thought about what this is. And so can you actually kind of level set with us, kind of what are the components of meritocracy? What is meritocracy, and what are the components when you actually think about it?
Yeah, and so the components really are, as I was thinking about how to possibly answer that type question, the components aren't complicated, right? The components of meritocracy it's an idea. I think one of the first things you need to realize, it's an ideal. It is a philosophy, if you will, that any social or economic, legal, political rewards that you receive tracks directly to your capability, your own skills, your ability. Your achievement is because you've earned it. So that's what meritocracy talks about, right? But the problem with meritocracy is it creates an almost impossible situation. And what's really fascinating, not only for the people who are at disadvantage because of this ideal, there are critiques in this space that say even the people who benefit from the notion of meritocracy, Markovich, who I'm going to talk about here in a moment, says that they're miserable, and that the outcomes of meritocracy actually working like it should is that people who are benefits from it are miserable. And I'll talk about that here in a moment. So the way to think about meritocracy then is there have been a couple critiques of it. And again, I'm going to geek out academic wise, and I'll try to keep it pretty quick.
PhDs are allowed to do that.
but it's interesting for people to understand that there's good research and discussions to be had around meritocracy, right? And so one of the critiques was this aspirational critique of meritocracy, and it argues that the problem with our current system that we have isn't the ideal of meritocracy itself, but it's the collective failure of us to live up to what meritocracy is supposed to produce. So aspirational critics say meritocracy is not the problem. It's the fact that we're not operating it right. Right. So that's one. So hold on to that for a second. Right. I think that's important. So then you have this principled critique of meritocracy that argues that any society that has socioeconomic rewards, or whatever rewards you say, that are based on merit, is itself inherently unjust. There's no way to make it just, because if it's based on this merit and the definition of merit and what you do, it's just going to be unjust. And so Markovich created this whole notion of the meritocracy trap, and I think that was one of the questions you wanted to get at. And the meritocracy trap, the book that was written by Markovich, was the scathing critique of primarily the aspirational critique that I just mentioned a moment ago, that the problem with our current system isn't the ideal of meritocracy, is that meritocracy isn't working like it should. And what he says, and Markovich argued that meritocracy itself is the problem, right? And that it produces a few things, right? And this is where I think the audience who does ID&E work can really get into it. He says that meritocracy produces radical inequality. It produces, and it stifles social mobility, and that it makes everyone, including, he calls them the winners, and he calls them elites, the ones who benefit from it, miserable. And it's super interesting. But at the same time, Markovich isn't ready to just reject meritocracy all in hand and saying that it's not possible. He thinks it's possible to create, but you have to re-envision how you do it, right? And so what Markovich would say, and I think this is interesting too, is that the rising inequality that we've seen is a product of meritocracy itself. And so what he says, it's really interesting that there's been a shift. If you go back 60, 70, 80, 90 years, you could always tell who was poor because they were working super hard. They were the ones working tons of hours and dirty, and the elites were the ones who could sit back and enjoy their wealth. He says that that's flipped. And then what's happened nowadays is that you have people who are like, Cody, how many hours a week do you work sometimes? 60, 70, 80 hours a week? Right? So what he's saying is that that's a product of meritocracy, because you've gotten the education, the skill, you've gotten to a position that you are in, and that you're working harder. And that actually the people who are in elites in your position and my position are actually 60, 70, 80, 90 hours. It far exceeds what people are doing in lower and middle class. And I think you can argue some of that, right? But stay with me. It's just principally what he's saying is that this is flipped. And then the product of meritocracy then is you've seen a changing in the type of education that people can get, the types of industries we're in. And so you have jobs the middle class and poor class would normally do are now being replaced by people who have this knowledge basis and technology and that kind of thing. So it shrinks the mobility of the middle class, because now they're not able to get the skills to get into this upper group that's dominated by the elites. So, which is fascinating. So what he says, and where this all plays out to on how it causes misery for everyone, is people's health have, because of the long hours people are working and this competitive drive that meritocracy drives, right? you're less healthy. You have less time to spend with your family. You have less time to build relationships. And in fact, one of the things he talks about, which is super interesting, you hear people all the time, and I don't know if you've ever say this, I want to spend quality time with my kids. And what he's saying, and Markovich is saying, is actually what they probably want is quantity time and not quality time. But because there's such a meritocratic drive to do this, it's created that kind of inequality. So it's a real long-winded response for your audience to think about. It's not just as simple to say meritocracy is false. There are certain critiques to look at it, whether it's aspirational or if it's the principled, and that, is meritocracy actually operating how it's supposed to and creating this inequality and stifled social class? Or is it not? The reason we see inequality is that it's not working as it should. So there's so many ways to think about it, man, but it's powerful to just, I think, understand the nuances so you can have the discussions with people about it. So that's a long-winded response.
No, well, I think that provides a lot of context. I see a question in the chat box, and I want to try to, I'm going to ask this question that's in the chat box, but one of the things that came to mind as you were talking about it, a lot of times when you work for companies, they will say, hey, we're a meritocracy, right? Everyone has an equal chance. As long as you put in the work and meet your goals and your requirements, we're gonna promote and we're gonna advance people based on the merit of your work. And the question that's in the chat box from Kay is, do companies use meritocracy as an excuse not to promote people? That's a pretty hot question, so I'll let you jump on that.
Yeah, no. So I think that's an amazing question. It's absolutely right. And in fact, what it says, it's super important. It's super interesting. Here, I'll even read this to you. It says, organizations that emphasize meritocratic ideas serve to reinforce an employee's belief that they are impartial, which creates the exact conditions under which implicit and explicit biases are unearthed. So in other words, the answer to that question, in my opinion, is yes, because a company that argues that it's meritocratic in its principles, where, if you work hard, you'll be successful, there's no bias, it fools managers into believing that they're completely objective and they're part of this meritocratic system, and that people who are being promoted because they've earned it, and that bias doesn't come into play. So absolutely bias comes into play. Absolutely, right? So it in a sense creates, and this is what a researcher named Castillo called the paradox of meritocracy, which is super interesting, Kay. And what it says is those who think they're the most objective can actually exhibit the most bias in their evaluations. It's because they feel like they're objective and unbiased, and they don't have to monitor or scrutinize their behavior. So do you see how that works? So the very notion of being in a meritocratic organization, that they keep preaching that, and that's part of their core values, it creates this false narrative, if you will, that I'm objective. And of course, if I don't promote someone, it's because they didn't deserve it. Had nothing to do with bias, had nothing to do with this. So absolutely, Kay, I think that's exactly what happens. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why people aren't promoted.
Wow, that's a great point. It sounds like there's a flaw, right? It sounds like there's a flaw because you're not looking at it truthfully. So
right.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
So repeat the question.
So what you're talking about almost makes it sound like there's a flaw in when you're thinking about meritocracy and how you evaluate people, and how you think you're creating this equality and opportunity for everyone regardless. But given the fact that there's that bias that's there, which means the person's not really looking at it correctly,
right.
Almost feels like there's an impact that's going to happen on any of your inclusion efforts, and it just does that tend to perpetuate the inequality in promotions and growth and advancement and all those things.
Yeah, no, it does. So that's exactly kind of the point that I'm making, is that until we challenge this notion, and it kind of goes with the question that Jackie has asked here too. What do you think the most impactful thing people can do in a meritocracy to be successful, right? So it kind of gets at what you're asking as well, I believe. And yes, I think holding on to this ideal of meritocracy and really pushing people to make the discussion of privilege and meritocracy taboo. I tell you, if you want to shut up an audience, man, or shut up a team meeting or something like that, bring up meritocracy or reverse discrimination or something along those lines that's all tied together, and there are crickets, right? And so, yes, holding on to this ideal, I think it just seeps its way into every one of those processes and structures, Cody, that you were talking about, whether you're talking about talent acquisition, talent management, promotions, review discussions, all that. If this overarching notion and ideal of meritocracy is just permeating and just being right around, everything that we do, because it makes us feel good about the decisions we make. It makes us feel good about how we've gotten what we've gotten and where we've gotten, right? And that the decisions we're making are correct. We always look to confirm that we're doing the right thing. And if we could use that principle to confirm what we're doing, even though data may point out, like you may even look and say, boy, 70% of everyone who got the least effective rating this time, they're all Hispanic. But it allows you to even justify something that's so glaringly wrong as that, to say it's just what they deserve and what they owned, right? So that's how I would answer, Cody, what you're talking about. And then Jackie, I think the best way to be, how people can do in a meritocracy to be successful, I think it's got to be a collective effort. No one person's going to be able to do it, but the best way to do it is to get your diversity specialists, your ID&E teams, your HR teams, your leaders, your executive, your business, to have the conversation about meritocracy and privilege, to own it, to make sure that they understand and recognize that bias does exist. Stereotypes do drive outcomes, right? The level of cultural competence of our leaders matters, right? If you're dealing on a global, organization, it's recognizing that you have privilege and that you need to use that privilege for the betterment of other people. So it's literally creating a workforce environment that's inclusive, aware, and equitable. So the best way I'd answer Jackie's question is, we have to hope that all the results of all the ID&E work and the push towards equity catches hold and actually snowballs, because that's how we're going to be able to survive in meritocratic in companies, is to get people to push past the notion that you can be successful no matter who you are. It's that American dream thing, right? Is that ideal. It's like, no matter who you are, if you work hard, you can be successful. And I think they used to say everyone will have a house and a chicken in your pod and a car in your garage or something if you work hard. We've got to just recognize that that's not the case. So I think the other thing that I would say to Jackie, quite frankly, too, and this is the unfortunate nature of this topic too, is that for Black and brown people and women to be successful, and other minorities, right? So people who with disabilities, people who have various gender identities who are different from the norm, you have to be excellent, and you have to really do super well at what you do, and make sure that you have visibility, make sure that people recognize what you do. And you can't do that alone. It takes both half of the system of what I've talked about earlier. So I'd say to Jackie is, unfortunately, you have to really crank and show them that you have value, and have value, and hope that the system is being body blowed to the point where it becomes actually an inclusive environment. So hopefully she sees that it's a system of things to be done. It's not one thing that you can do. You are embedded in a system that needs to change for you to have success in the meritocratic organization. Does that make sense, Cody? Does that?
Yeah. No, it makes all the sense in the world. It makes me think about, like, I remember when I would be growing up or join an organization, and I would always hear my parents would say, look, you've got to be 5 times better than the other people who don't look like you are. It's just part of what it is. But I never thought about it in this way. And it makes me go, I'm walking in thinking the playing field is leveled because I'm an expert in the field that I'm in. I've done great stuff, amazing, great experience. And
that's the false promise of meritocracy, right? It's the notion that the playing field is level, and people hold on to that. And it's like, slavery's gone. It's been years, right? Women can vote. That's been years, it's all this kind of stuff. And people don't think about the lingering impacts of what you could trace as as an aside, I recently created a slide for tying slavery all the way through to what we see today about the angry black male syndrome and the angry black woman syndrome. So you literally have threads that you can actually see where that stereotype of the coon and the sambo and for women the sapphire and all that kind of stuff, that all threads to how Black men and women are perceived in the workplace today. That's not a level playing field. We're still dealing with the legacy of slavery, even in the current workplace. You can trace the violence that you see towards Asians nowadays. You can trace that to exclusionary acts that happened because someone came up with this ideal of the yellow peril. We've got to be careful of the yellow peril, and so all of a sudden you have all these exclusion acts, and you can see how that traces to what's called the bamboo ceiling, right? Where Asian people are modeled minorities, right? But they still hit a ceiling and they call it the bamboo ceiling. They can't get through. So Cody, no, right? It's like there isn't a level playing field still. We are still dealing with those institutionalized forms of discrimination and oppression that are rooted in slavery and illegal acts. And I mean, the playing field, even if you look at it today, and it get me all fired up about this question, like if you look at the playing field today, look at the voting, the voter suppression laws, the new forms of Jim Crow that are happening in Arizona, in Georgia, and other states around this. So that's not a level playing field, right? That is skewing the playing field to maintain dominance and power.
Yeah, no, and you're talking about real topics here, right? That people don't want to pay attention to.
No.
It seems like, well, it appears that it could be one of the impacts on what's happening with our society, potentially our economy. Is something around meritocracy damaging our economy and our society?
I argue the ideal of it is definitely damaging it. Here's why it's damaging it: because it is creating barriers for ingenuity, innovation that you would get from the value and power of diversity. One of the biggest arguments we make around the diversity space, and you and I have had these conversations way back in the day, right? About, it's the intersection of all this diverse talent that creates, innovation, creativity for the solutions you make for your customers and your clients and all that kind of stuff. Meritocracy, it creates this insidious circle, if you will, right? It creates an opportunity where certain people, and as Markovich has said and Castillo said, is this snowball effect of inequality, right? Where you have certain people have gotten certain jobs, they've gotten to be able to build wealth and income and power, and they passed on to their kids, and their kids pass on their kids, so it becomes this cycle. And then you have a groups of people who pass on poverty instead of equity and wealth and that kind of thing. So, and then the insidious nature of it, to your point, is then people in the position who benefit from this privilege and this power and this ideal of meritocracy blame the people for their own failure. So they blame the folks who are not being successful on how they're lazy, they don't work hard, they don't do anything, instead of seeing it's the system they're embedded in. Right? You see that? And here's the other insidious thing, Cody, about what you were saying is one of the insidious parts of an ideal of meritocracy is it gets the middle class and lower class to believe that they actually are the problem. It is my fault. And so you have that kind of thing too. Does that make sense? Right? So yeah, it's stifling growth, it's stifling creativity, it's stifling the belief that anyone and everyone can contribute to society in real ways, because it's not allowing certain people to play. It's keeping the playing field unlevel, and the ones that will benefit the least from it is broader society.
Wow.
See what I'm saying? So see what happens when you get creativity together, you get multiple people together, and what you can produce and what you can do, right? It's astounding and amazing, and meritocracy keeps you from doing that because it's that ideal.
Yeah, this is an eye-opening conversation for me because I just haven't thought about it. I always thought about, hey, just work harder, do more, align to the goals. I see a question in here.
Two of them.
So one of the questions says, how does meritocracy impact remote teams? Wow, that's a relevant question today for sure.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So honestly, how best to answer that question. Um, so I think people feel like if everyone's remote and everyone is working remotely, and so theoretically everyone's equal, because now no one has this, because there's a bias called distance bias. So the closer you are to headquarters and leaders, the more effective or successful you can be. And there are companies that you can't, if you work in the field, you're not going to get promoted unless you work at headquarters, right? So there is that. And so theoretically, working remotely eliminates that. But here's the interesting thing, right? And it's not just working. Let's think about society and school and those kinds of things. So not everyone has the same access to the same types of internet possibility and infrastructure to do this right? If someone is socioeconomically not as, so like for me and my kids, I mean, I have my own office upstairs. Everyone has internets and computers. So there's some privilege you have with economic security, right? And so we can adjust to some of the what happens because of remote working, but a lot of people don't. A lot of people can't, right? There's research that actually shows too, if you think about meritocracy, and again, merit is no matter how hard you work, if you work hard, you're going to be successful. You have women, this recent article said that one of the biggest impacts to any particular group in our society because of this remote working has been women, because they primarily do most of the childcare still. And so if you happen to be a woman who has kids, or a woman who has family responsibilities as senior citizen, elderly folks, your parents, you have to take care of them. It's not the man who is stepping up, the male, if that's part of the relationship, it's a male-female relationship, right? I'm just making that assumption. And for this particular example, they're not doing it. Women are the ones who are still producing primary child care in those situations. Kids sitting at home, having to go to school, handling kindergartners while they're trying to do Zoom calls and do their work. And so women are working just ungodly hours, and they're having more impact. So if you start seeing their productivity slip, or they don't appear to be as engaged, or they're literally tired and can't function as well as they have been, how is merit coming into play if you have a situation where you don't have that, right? Where you can focus on your Zoom meetings, you can do this, you can take advantage of the fact you don't have to commute in. So that's how I would say is that in fact, this remote working has exposed another barrier towards a minority group, which have been women. And then if you look at intersections and you look at race and gender, and you think about socioeconomic capability and all those kinds of stuff, then you have access to less technology and better technology and use to it, and it's a struggle. And so in fact, it's exasperated it as opposed to making it more fair. If that's, I know, again, long-winded response, but that's what you get for me.
Helpful, definitely.
And it was, there was another question up here a moment ago too. Oh, it is, no, this one. What should leaders do? You want me to jump into this one, Cody? I know that's something that we had talked about too, about the leaders.
Yeah. I think this is really helpful because, go ahead and take that one.
Yeah. So when I think about what leaders should be doing, if you think about my discussion of what inclusive leaders should do, so you get a little hint of what I think inclusive leaders and leaders should do. I think leaders should do a number of things. I think leaders need to challenge notions within their sphere of responsibility that privilege isn't real and that meritocracy is how people succeed. Things are not going to change in the corporate situation where you work until leaders recognize this and make a point of being aware that promotions, visibility to leadership, getting the best jobs, getting in high potential programs, all these different things that leaders have control and you're doing is not going to be effective in work unless you start with the premise that that privilege is, that meritocracy isn't real, and that privilege is something that has to be dealt with. I think leaders have to full on jump into inclusion. I think the best way, even if you think of Markovich or some of these other arguments of how to fix meritocracy, is about creating more access to income and wealth and jobs and growth. So in other words, remove any stagnated growth within our society from middle class to upper class. So eliminate that, compress that. It's called compressed meritocracy or egalitarian meritocracy. So leaders have got to become champions of inclusion and to make sure everyone has access to the goodies in order to be successful, so what you're doing, to your point, is you actually are leveling the playing field. So that's what they should do. So they should work towards leveling the playing field by fully jumping on and embracing inclusion. Here's a couple other things that I would say. They need to wake up every single day. Leaders need to wake up every single day with a dilemma that marginalized people, that there are marginalized people, and that they should do their part to address it. If you're in a position of power, if you are someone who owns a company, if you're someone who owns a radio talk show, and you have a massive audience, you have the responsibility to get fired up that this American dream is a sham, that not everyone who wants to be successful can be successful by working hard, because we see every day that that's not the case. So leaders need to have a dilemma that there's a problem and I need to fix it, and I'm going to use my power and privilege to do so. Two other quick things. Make sure equity is top of mind. Nowadays, Cody, even when we were together at Microsoft, we didn't talk about equity. We talked about diversity.
Yeah.
And then soon we talked about diversity and inclusion. Now we talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity. And there's been a lot of that because of the acknowledgement that institutionalized forms of discrimination and oppression are what's maintaining the system, right? It's what's making it hard for people to be successful. Equity is now what this is all about. Equity is about fairness. Equity is about making sure that equal opportunity isn't where we stop, that we actually look at what are the outcomes of that equal opportunity. It should be fair. And if it's not, we need to fix it. And so equity, so leaders need to be thinking about equity. And the last thing that I'll say, and there probably more that we could put in there, is leaders need to lean into overlooked people. They need to lean into the success of overlooked people.
Yeah.
You have a choice between two people, someone who's always gotten this position, part of the privileged, majority, and you have someone who is capable right there, may not have quite the experience and may lack some of the experience needed for the job. What leaders need to do is lean into that person, create the capability within them, lean in to make sure they're successful, and give them an opportunity, because it's so stacked against people nowadays. And you see this a lot. Where you see this a lot is because of the pandemic. There's so many unemployed people. And so hundreds of people are applying for one job. And so people are looking at experience. You see what I'm saying? So we've got to lean into the people who are overlooked and make sure they can be successful. That's what I would suggest that leaders do. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I know I want to be respectful of the time, make sure that if we don't get answers to any questions. One of the things the point you made just now about leaders need to lean into it and recognize, marginalized people and work to get that equity. What do you do, and what advice do you have for those leaders? Because leaders get tired, right? There's so much in the world that the leaders don't even want to think about privilege and meritocracy, unconscious bias, all the inclusion and diversity topics, and all the other things that they're dealing with on a daily basis. What advice do you have for leaders and your everyday people that are walking along doing their job to help them get through and survive, not just survive, but to move forward, right? Any share with that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One of this, and I don't know if I can say this on the air, but my hard ass response is
say anything about our webinar. We speak truth to power.
Okay, truth to power. My hard ass response is if you really want to make a difference, you don't have a choice not to ignore privilege and meritocracy and your responsibility and inclusion and diversity. And if you're not doing what I said a moment ago, you're not waking up with a dilemma, right? So I'll start off with the premise that they need to, as hard as it may be, think about how hard it is if you aren't in those positions to do that. And if you don't have the power, we all are privileged in one way or the other, but it's to what degree, right? So here's what I would say. Here's how to facilitate that. Leaders have got to stop thinking that they have to recreate the wheel, change every bit of something to make something effective and have an impact. There's another perspective, and it's a woman named Deborah Meyerson has come up with this notion of the tempered radical. And it's a wonderful book that Deborah Meyerson, and I think she renamed it to Rocking the Boat. So if you go out on, it's whatever, however, I don't want to say go to Amazon and order it, because you can do it in multiple ways, but go to Amazon and order it. It's a wonderful book, and what it says in there is how do leaders affect change, and how do leaders affect change in this space. You don't have to recreate the wheel. So what she talks about is leaders need to rock the boat, rock it hard, but keep themselves and others in the boat, because you can't affect change if you're out of the boat. So that's one. And then that really gets at to what leaders can do. The other part of what she talks about, the other analogy she uses, the other description is she talks about dropping pebbles that cause ripples. So leaders should drop pebbles, not change everything. Drop a pebble that causes a ripple, that causes someone else to drop a pebble that causes a ripple, that causes someone else to drop a pebble that causes a ripple. It's the aggregation of all those pebbles that leads to systemic change. You don't have to do it yourself, leader. You just have to do your part. And your part might be, I'm going to lean into her. I know everyone on the hiring committee wants this guy, but I'm going to lean into her because I'm going to give her a chance to be successful. We're going to make sure she's successful. That's all you need to do. And then that committee might have someone on that committee goes, wow, that's really interesting. So the next time they're on a committee, they may drop a pebble in the same way. You see what I'm saying? So you don't have to fix everything yourself. You just have to do your part. And sometimes your part could be as little as making a comment in a meeting that says, hey, you know what? We keep discounting her perspective and talking over her. I think that's wrong. I think let's hear what she has to say. I think she has a valid point. And the idea you just gave is what she said 10 minutes ago. That is a pebble you can drop that may change a dynamic in a room, that may increase the person's engagement, the woman's hope that she's going to be successful. Maybe you don't lose her now to attrition and she stays. So there's so many benefits to just doing a simple thing, Cody. So that's what leaders can do is, and to the question the person on the screen says, the most important thing a person can do about meritocracy and privilege is acknowledge it. And realize it's real and adjust your behavior because of it. If you treat this kind of discussion we're having today, or lessons and learnings about meritocracy and privilege, and you go about doing the same old thing, you just do check the box, you're not doing anything. What we need you to do is change your behavior, acknowledge it, recognize it, and then change your behavior about it. Drop a pebble. You don't have to recreate the whole thing. Let other people create whole systems and structures, right? Just do one thing that makes a difference. And then when you think about it, if you have 50 leaders in an organization doing one thing each week, I mean, that adds up over, I don't know what 50 times 300, 365 days or 52 weeks or what, that's a lot of change that could happen. And that's how culture shifts. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, that is amazing. It's really powerful. Eddie, I want to thank you. This has been phenomenal. I've learned a ton on this, and I really appreciate that. If there are any questions that come up we didn't get a chance to get to, we'll get those questions and get those to you. But I'm really thankful that you joined us, and I know the audience is going to benefit greatly from just some of the key things you talked about. So any parting thoughts for our audience?
Again, so I'll give you a challenge. I mean, that's something that I like to do. I'll challenge everyone in the audience to a couple things. I'll challenge you to not take my word for anything I said today. Go do your own research and start thinking about how you have privilege. Everyone has privilege. So think about how you have privilege and figure out a way to help others who don't have that same privilege. So I challenge you to do that. Make this topic your own. And I also challenge people to don't leave here today and just go about your business like you do every day. I think you should have a dilemma that the ideals of meritocracy, they're kind of cool to think about. Let's all make them real. So that's my challenge. That's what I would say to people is don't leave this place and do the same old thing you do every day. Then this has been a waste of time, right? Go do something different. Challenge yourself. Be a tempered radical is what I would say.
That's awesome. I love the temperate radical. Well, Eddie, thank you very much. Thank everyone for joining us. We'll make sure that the replay is available. I'm thrilled to have you, Eddie, and appreciate it. Hope you have an amazing afternoon.
Cody, thank you. Anytime I can hang with you, brother, that's anytime, man. Just give me a shout. I'll come chill with you for sure. All right, Cody.
Take care.
Right, thank you.
All right. Bye.